Benzagura Pema Siddhi Hum. Om Na Hum Benzagura Pema Siddhi Hum. Om Na Hum Benzagura Pema Siddhi Hum. Okay, namaskar everyone. Welcome to my Sunday Dharma talk here at the Buddhist Center. Today is the second talk in a series of 9 talks, which we're doing as a supplement to our series of 34 talks on the Digha Nikaya, which we just completed last June and which is now this month, in fact, been published as a book by Kronecker Press called Conversations with the Buddha, a Reader's Guide to the Digha Nikaya. So, as I explained last time, we're picking out the longer suttas of the Majjhima Nikaya, the second book of the Sutta Pitaka, which is essentially a reputed textbook of the Buddha Dharma, originating from the 1st century BCE. So we're going to do the second. May I ask, where are the note cards at your simmer located? I couldn't find them. They are located in the bookcase, which is in the corner adjacent to the teapot. So if you go in the front door and you look to your right, you'll see a bookcase in the corner. If you walk towards it on your left, in the corner, you'll see a floating message on it. And yeah, it would be to the left. Well, not left from the door. As you walk in the door, look to your right into the corner, and then go to the left part of that corner, as opposed to the right side of the corner. Go to the left side of the corner. There's a bookcase there, and there's floating text on it saying, please click me to get a book, or something like that. And if you click it, you'll find all the note cards. This is driven by a menu system. There's about 100 now, and you can take them. And I should mention, since you're asking that these talks are all available on note cards, so if you'd like one, simply message me at the end of the talk. So this is the well, there's only one. No, there's only one new note card, which is the Majjhima Nikaya last week, and I think I did put it in the bookcase. So I mean, beyond the Digha Nikaya, there is only the one. This will be number 2, and I'm sure that I've been putting the Digha Nikaya note cards in the bookcase as we go along, but I will double check that. Although they're old now anyway. So there's only one new one. That's Majjhima Nikaya from last week, plus today's. Okay, so actually I haven't given you my personal information. There you go, for anyone who's new. So we're discussing the longer suttas of the 9 longest suttas of the Majjhima Nikaya, which are equal in length to the average length of suttas in the Digha Nikaya, mainly for the reasons of practicality. To fill an hour with talk requires a 12 or 13 page sutta, and in fact today's, which was 13 pages I think, 12 or 13, or even 14, I only have about half an hour's worth of material, simply because that's the nature of what was in the sutta. Plus, I don't want to go into too much detail on some things which we've already covered in previous talks. So if you have any questions during the course of the presentation, please feel free to ask them, and we can discuss afterwards at Dharma by the Tracks if anyone is interested. So the title of today's sutta is the Mahasihanada Sutta, which is sutta number 12 in the Majjhima Nikaya. The Buddha is living outside Vesali in a grove to the west of the city. Vesali was the capital of the Lichavi tribe. Oh, I should also mention, just before I get into it, that if you want to follow along, the Majjhima Nikaya version that I'm using is the translation of Bhikkhu Nanamoli and Bhikkhu Bodhi, called The Middle Length Discourses of the Buddha, published by Wisdom Publications. And you can also find them online too. So if you want to read the sutta before the presentation, which I do recommend, that's how you would do it. And you can check the first talk on www.palisuttas.com, my blog, for a list of all the suttas that we're going to be discussing. So, the Buddha in connection with today's Sutta, the Mahasihanada Sutta, the Buddha is living outside Vesali in a grove to the west of the city. Vesali was the capital of the Lichavi tribe in the Vajrayan Confederacy, which you may recall from our discussion of the Suttas of the Digha Nikaya, was the Buddha took as a model for the organization of the Sangha. Interestingly, the Vajrayans are both the model, the Buddha most respected as a political model, which he took as the basis for his own Sangha, his own order, and also it was the source of the first schism, came from the Vajrayans as well. The Lichavis were an individualistic people who had a quasi-democratic constitution. Today it's an archaeological site in Bihar state. It was also the birthplace of Mahavira, the leader of the Jains during the Buddha's lifetime. So it's not surprising that the Buddha would frequent such a place. You find him sort of tracking different cities that he emphasizes are also places connected to Jainism. And if you look at the symbology of Jainism, you can see there's quite a resemblance to Buddhism, although there's some fundamental doctrinal differences. And of course, the Jains are targeted in the Pali Canon for criticism, being the Buddhism's major competitor at the time. The Jains and the Ajivikas rather, were the two main competitive philosophies to Buddhism in 5th century BCE, northeast India. It's also the location where the Buddha went to be trained in meditation by Brahmaputra first, and then by Alara Kalama, right at the very beginning of his spiritual career after he renounced the life of the home. He also preached his final sermon here, and also informed Ananda here that he would die in 3 months. And this is all from the Mahasihanada Sutta, of course, which you'll remember from our discussions of the Digha Nikaya. And also the Second Buddhist Council was held here, which was the source, as I mentioned, of the first schism. At the time of the Buddha, Vesali is large, rich, prosperous, and crowded with abundant food. It was a beautiful city with 7,707 pleasure grounds, which I'm assuming were a kind of park, and 7,707 lotus ponds inhabited by 7,707 rajas. This was also the home of the royal courtesan and famous dancer, who was also a wealthy woman, Amrapali, who was a great patron of the city as well, and also a great patron of the Buddha. And of course, the Buddha saw her, I think the year before, certainly in the last years before his death. I think it was the year before he went to her home. And she subsequently became an arhat herself. So a female arhat. The date of this sutta is about the same time as the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. That is just before the Buddha's death at the age of 80. Since the Buddha says that he is, quote, now old, aged, burdened with years, advanced in life, and come to the last stage, my years have turned 80, unquote. There is some ambiguity about the date, however, since the text also states that during the course of the sutta, the Buddha was being fanned by Nagasamala, a task usually reserved for the Buddha's personal attendant. Nagasamala had been the personal attendant of the Buddha during the first 20 years of the Buddha's career. However, it's possible that Nagasamala was still a bhikkhu, though no longer the Buddha's attendant at the end of his life, and was fanning the Buddha for some reason. Of course, Ananda normally would have been the one. Nagasamala himself could not have been much less than 50 at this time in this case. So it's a curiosity. Those of you who attended my series of talks on the Digha Nikaya may remember the Lichavi Sunakata, who left the Sangha because the Buddha did not perform any miracles or explain to him the beginning of things. That's in Digha Nikaya 24. So those of you who attended my series of talks on the Digha Nikaya may remember the Lichawi Sunakata, who left the Sangha because the Buddha did not perform any miracles or explain to him the beginning of things. It's in the Digha Nikaya 24. I seem to remember something about him leaving the Sangha like one condemned to hell, quote unquote, if I'm thinking of the same person. Subsequently, he went to the Vesali Assembly, the public meeting place where decisions were made, it being, as I mentioned, a democracy, sort of like the ancient Greek democracies in democracy in Athens, actually, and denied that the Buddha has any superhuman states, any distinction in knowledge, or any vision worthy of the Arhat. So obviously he's pursuing a vendetta against the Buddha. The Buddha was not popular with everyone or everywhere. There were towns where he and his followers were not welcome. And of course, his cousin Devadatta tried to murder him. He accuses the Buddha of being a rationalist, intellectual, essentially, translating it into 20th or 21st century language. He accuses him of being a rationalist intellectual who is merely following out his own arguments, not based on realization or any higher attainments. He asserts that the cessation of suffering is inferior to the attainment of high psychic powers. In a sense, Sunakata's criticism is justified in the sense that the Buddha did apply intellectual criteria to Brahmanic traditions and sought to identify a rational, non-mythological teaching within the Vedic tradition that had been overgrown by mythological concepts and superstitious beliefs. And he did teach the cessation of suffering as the primary or ultimate goal. At the same time that Sunakata was addressing the Lichawi, Sariputta, the disciple foremost in wisdom, was visiting Vesali on alms round and heard Sunakata's speech, which he sort of probably something like, either he was speaking at a meeting of the assembly, or it was something like Speaker's Corner in London, where people just stand up and speak. And as to which of those it was, those seem to be the two logical alternatives. As to which of those it was, I have no information. In any case, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. In any case, sorry, I lost my spot. Just give me a moment. Right. In any case, Sariputta heard Sunakata's speech, which he told to the Buddha on his return to the grove where they were staying. The Buddha shrugs off Sunakata's comments as inspired by anger and points out that the criticism that the Buddha teaches the way to the cessation of suffering is actually a compliment. The rest of the sutta appears as a rebuttal of Sunakata's criticism of the Buddha, including the 10 powers of a Tathagata, 4 kinds of intrepidity, 8 assemblies, 4 kinds of generation, 5 destinations, and Nibbana and the Bodhisattva's austerities. I'm seeing some chat going past. Let me just see if there's any questions for me in any of it. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'm just going to carry on. The Buddha says that Sunakata will never acknowledge the Buddha's enlightenment or his psychic powers, consisting of self-multiplication, invisibility, passing through matter, and levitation. This is the stock list of psychic powers which one finds in the Pali Canon, to the embarrassment of some religious Buddhists. Nonetheless, there they are. We've discussed these psychic powers before, so I'm not going to repeat myself here in terms of what they might mean or their possible implications or interpretations. We can discuss that in the chat afterwards if anyone's interested. The meaning of this sutta is the discourse on the great lion's roar, by which the wheel of Dharma is set rolling. That is, the Dharma age is inaugurated, and we've discussed what is meant by a Dharma age before as well. If anyone needs any clarification of these points because they didn't attend previous talks, though, by all means, just put your question in the chat. We can discuss, or we can discuss afterwards. We've encountered the Dharma wheel, of course, in the Digha Nikaya, in the story of Mahasihanada, which is the Digha Nikaya Sutta 17, to whom it appeared as essentially, not to put too fine a point on it, a UFO, and through which he conquered his neighbors and established a peaceable Dharma kingdom. And at some point in the future, I will be doing a talk on the UFO phenomenon in the Pali Canon when I have an opportunity. The Sutta enumerates 10 powers of a Tathagata, by which the Buddha's primogeniture is established, and this list has appeared elsewhere appears elsewhere as well, in comparison with the 10 powers of an Arhat, which are different. So the 10 powers of a Tathagata, which are subsequently explained in the Sutta, are one. Actually, I'll put them in the chat as well. One, understanding what is possible and what is impossible, a sort of even a scientific understanding of just the laws of nature and what can and cannot happen, but understood in a more metaphysical way, I think. Understanding karma in the same sort of way, cause and effect. So understanding the world, ontological knowledge, and ontological understanding, the kind of understanding that some religious Buddhists like to deny that the Buddha had, a theory of being, a theory of ontology. Third, understanding the 5 destinations, which are the 5 classes of rebirth: devas, humans, animals, ghosts, and hell beings, and subsequently asuras or anti-gods. All these are things that we've discussed in the past, but if you need clarification of anything, just ask. Understanding the elements of the world, which is meant in a very basic way, understanding what the world is made of, what we would call the atomic or subatomic realms. Understanding the inclinations of beings. Understanding the 5 faculties, which consist of faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. So understanding people, basically, to simplify it. A deep understanding of people and what's going on with people internally. Understanding the elements of the path. Understanding, including the 84,000 techniques, so not just the basics, but understanding a perfect understanding of all the different aspects of spiritual development or Dharma realization. Understanding rebirth. Understanding karma, which is karma, specifically the karma of others. In other words, being able to discern the patterns of karmic cause and effect as they appear in the world, which is called the divine eye. And understanding the destruction of the taints, the asavas, corruptions, the taints, corruptions, is another translation, which consists of sensuality, becoming, false views, and ignorance by the cultivation of, or as a result of the cultivation of wisdom. And in accordance with the doctrine of the power of truth, which we've discussed in previous talks also, these understandings are described as powers. So understanding and understandings are powers. Truth is powerful in the Buddhist as well as the Vedic worldview. Truth, because of its correspondence to reality, has the whole inertia of reality behind it. So it's extraordinarily significant and even energetic or powerful in the Buddhist worldview. The 10 powers of a Tathagata, the 10 powers of a Buddha, which I'll put in, again, I just read them out, but I'll put them in the chat again for you. So there they are. The Buddha declares that anyone who denies the attainment of the Tathagata, which is, of course, the Buddha's name for himself, we've discussed the word Tathagata before too, will be reborn in a hellish rebirth. The Buddhist hells must be distinguished from the hell of the Semitic traditions, however, which is rather a kind of purgatory, from which rebirth becomes possible once the negative karma is extirpated through suffering. I've answered your question, Taquito. I've even put the powers in the chat. There you are. There you are. The Buddha declares that any... I did that. The Buddha declares also that he's fully enlightened and has destroyed the taints or corruptions, that those things that he has declared to be obstructions or hindrances is another translation that one sees, which consist of sensuality, anger, sloth, agitation, and uncertainty, are obstructions or hindrances in fact, and that his Dharma does lead to the cessation of suffering. So if you do a comparison, you'll see that all these points that he's raising are really rebuttals to the assertions of what is his name? Subhakata, is it? I've forgotten now what his name is. The Buddha further declares that he is at home in the assemblies of nobles, Brahmins, householders, recluses, Devas of the realm of the 4 great kings, which is of course the next realm above our own in the vertical cosmology of Buddhism, Devas of the realm of the 33, the gods that the Devas that reside at the apex, the truncated apex of Mount Meru, Mara's retinue, interestingly, so he's at home amongst Mara's retinue as well, typically regarded as wicked, and the Devas of the Brahma realm. He's at home with all of these different kinds of beings. The Buddha describes the 4 kinds of rebirths: egg-born, womb-born, moisture-born, and spontaneously generated. Pretty self-evident. I'm not going to go into them too much. The latter, spontaneous generation, is interesting, however. This refers to how devas are reborn. And the most interesting thing about this passage is that the Buddha identifies, quote, certain human beings, unquote, as well as devas, hell beings, and some beings of the lower worlds, as spontaneously born. And I am very interested to know who these certain human beings that are spontaneously born are. I have no idea. And so I'm open to... Rollo asks, maybe Jesus. Maybe indeed. I don't know. I have no other references that I've seen in the Pali Canon that explain that reference. So I'm not sure. I'm sure it's there somewhere. I'm just not aware of it. So if anyone finds out who the spontaneously born human beings are, they get a gold star. And the some beings of the lower worlds who are spontaneously born are things like flies, which I believe were believed in Europe too. I believe they were believed to have been spontaneously born in rotting carcasses, and possibly other things too. Falsely, of course, but that was the belief. In addition, he identifies the 5 types of rebirth, 5 in the Sutta: hell beings, animals, ghosts, human beings, and devas. The later Buddhist tradition would add the anti-gods to this list, but not so much later as to be outside the canon. So we've discussed the 6 classes of beings in the past as well, which includes the anti-gods, which are canonical. Finally, he identifies nirvana, which is attained by the individual for himself or herself. We've heard this before in the Digha Nikaya as well, that spiritual realization is something that one pursues for oneself and achieves by oneself, perhaps with the assistance of others, of course, but ultimately it's an individual thing, which is paradoxical in view of the Buddhist doctrine of no self, or anatta. So nirvana is attained by the individual for himself or herself. There's no gender discrimination. Through gnosis in the present moment, the now, as a result of mental cultivation and the realization of wisdom by which the taints are destroyed. The Buddha declares that he knows the behaviors that will lead to rebirth in each of these states. In a memorable simile, he compares the experience of nirvana to dallying in a dense woods, adjacent to a cool pond of good water after bathing and slaking one's thirst on a hot day. Yet again paralleling a similar simile of Yeshua, or Jesus, of course. There's a lot of similarities between the similes of the Buddha and the similes of Yeshua, which suggests the possibility of influence, which theoretically was possible. Whether it's provable or is another matter. But Ashoka had sent Buddha representatives to the West, some of whom visited Greece and Rome, and therefore it's quite possible that there was a Buddhist influence on Galilee as well, which was famous for its Asian influences and notorious amongst the Orthodox rabbis of Jerusalem. In any case, far from describing nirvana as an effectively neutral state, which is how it's generally perceived by Westerners, the Buddha describes nirvana as extremely pleasant. The same phrase he uses for the Deva states. So nirvana is not a neutral state, it's an ecstatic state. It is the bliss that transcends bliss. Tokito Ibi asks, Buddha believed not in miracle. That's an interesting question. The Buddha did not say that he did not believe in miracles or psychic powers, which is a better translation, or supernormal powers, or superhuman powers, or magical powers, all of which would be valid in translations in terms of the Pali. He did not say that he did not believe in those things. He said that they were not worthy of pursuit, except for the recollection of past lives, which is emphasized in the Pali Canon as an attainment of the Buddha. But psychic powers are never denied, only whether they are worthwhile is questioned and even denied. And so especially the public demonstration of psychic powers was heavily criticized by the Buddha, again with the apparent exception of the recollection of past lives, which he himself exhibited on numerous occasions, according to the Suttas. So that's the answer to your question, Tokito. The Buddha declares that he recalls practicing extreme asceticism, coarseness, scrupulousness, and seclusion. The Buddha describes, these are all ascetic practices, of course, four classifications, if you like, of asceticism. The Buddha describes the ascetic practices of Northeast India of his time, which we've already itemized in our series of talks on the Digha Nikaya at some length. So I'm not going to go into them here in detail. All the things that we associate with India: starving oneself, mortifying the flesh, standing with one's arm up in the air for an entire lifetime, not bathing or excessive bathing, social disobedience, all those things. Except I will quote the memorable passage, quote, "I would make my bed in a charnel ground with the bones of the dead for a pillow," which I have always liked. So that's, of course, the kind of practice that the Buddha was engaged in for 6 years after he left home. and before his enlightenment. Interestingly, the Buddha refers specifically to the 8-day interval of frost around late December, early January, during which he says he dwelled out of doors, as he did most of the time except for the rainy season. We discussed the question of how cold winter gets in northeast India in our series of talks on the Digha Nikaya. There's a disagreement between Shuman and Hajime Nakamura. Hajime Nakamura on that question of how cold it got. This arises in connection with the question of when the Buddha died, because it seems that he died in late winter, just prior to his 80th birthday. 80th birthday as we would calculate it. In India, of course, the birthday was calculated from a conception, not from birth. This sutta also preserves a tradition that we find elsewhere in the Pali Canon, especially in the Therigatha and in the Therigatha, whereby a realized person utters a spontaneous poem as an expression of their realization. This tradition became especially important in Tibet, as well as in the Chan or Zen Buddhism, where such verses took the form of enigmatic riddles, the so-called Quan. The reference to purification comes about through food, which is the aphorism that the Buddha quotes, and which appears elsewhere in the Pali Canon. Nutriment is an important concept in the canon, but here it refers to self-starvation, a practice that the Buddha practiced but then repudiated on the verge of death. And you can see him in on the board to my left. There's a picture of the Buddha when towards the end of his period of asceticism, when he was approaching dying as a consequence of his more self-mortifications. Thus he says, quote, "By such conduct, by such practice, by such performance of austerities, I did not obtain any superhuman states, any distinction in knowledge and vision worthy of the noble ones." Unquote. And in other talks I have suggested that possibly the Buddha did experience Kundalini awakening during this period of self-mortification. There's some evidence of that in the canon, what we would call Kundalini awakening. Similar to the famous Guru Adida achieved before he went off his rocker. And in this context, the Buddha, of course, is suggesting that that's a relatively insignificant attainment, which is a widespread view in the Indian tradition. Also, widespread views that can make you a little bit nuts. The reason that the Buddha gives for this is telling, quote, "Why was that? Because I did not attain that noble wisdom which, when attained, is noble and emancipating and leads the one who practices in accordance with it to the complete destruction of suffering." Unquote. That is, and I've mentioned this before, the essential salvific principle is not asceticism or even meditation, but wisdom, through which alone emancipation is attained and suffering completely destroyed. Those of you who have attended my previous talks will know that I frequently emphasize this much neglected point, which subsequently became the basis of the Prajnaparamita tradition of the Mahayana. I see a question. Rollo asks, is that referring to his abandonment of asceticism? What do you mean by that? What are you referring to exactly? His criticism of asceticism? Yes, that's why he abandoned asceticism. He abandoned asceticism because it was not leading to emancipation or enlightenment. It was leading to death of the body. And but yes, that's the reason why he abandoned it, because he was not achieving his goal, which was ultimately the solution of the problem of suffering. So I frequently emphasize this much neglected point, which subsequently became the basis of the Prajnaparamita tradition of the Mahayana, just about the same time that the Pali Canon was first set to writing, which was in the 1st century before the Common Era. Neither morality nor even meditation is the essential salvific principle, but wisdom, the cure for ignorance or not knowing, is that by which emancipation is won. And when there are passages that point to this, I point them out in order to demonstrate my basic thesis, which is that the message of the entire Pali Canon is just this, that wisdom and not morality and not meditation is the essential salvific principle. Yes, meditation is necessary. Perhaps meditation is Meditation is certainly necessary. The Buddha never states that meditation is not necessary. After achieving the awakening, as a result of the Dharma talk in brief, there are those who would go into seclusion and meditate for a minimum of 7 days, and thus achieve either the state of a stream winner, or the state of some sort, or the state of an arhat, depending on the vestigial karma. So the Buddha never says that meditation is not necessary, but he does, and it's very clear. If you collect all the passages together, it's very clear that wisdom is the essential salvific principle, which is then amplified, intensified, and perfected by the practice of meditation. But that meditation by itself, practiced by itself, is not sufficient. And perhaps meditation is also necessary in combination with wisdom to achieve the ultimate wisdom. But there has to be, the wisdom component has to be present and realized for meditation to be effective. And the Dalai Lama says this too. I have a YouTube video by the Dalai Lama in which he also says this. And this is very much misunderstood by many Westerners who think that practicing meditation is the essential thing. And it's not. It's a skillful means. It's a secondary thing to wisdom. Wisdom, the cultivation of wisdom, the attainment of right view, which is the first step of the Noble Eightfold Path, that is the essential thing. And I've discussed that at some length in previous talks. So Tia says, so meditation is the path, not the destination. Yes, and really, so is wisdom, ultimately, is also the path, but it is the essential principle of the path, and the rest are secondary. Because it's the cure for ignorance, which is the root of paticca samuppada, the chain of dependent origination. And if you read the Pali Canon, you see that people would achieve awakening spontaneously as a result of simply listening to a Dharma talk by the Buddha. And that in itself would precipitate awakening in those who are suitably karmically prepared. The Buddha repudiates the notion, characteristic of the Ajivikas, a popular sect at the time, and we've mentioned them before, that purification comes about through the round of rebirths. The Ajivicans, you may recall, were the determinists, the fatalists, the determinists, who believed that the soul passes through a preordained series of experiences in which it experiences every possible samsaric state, after which it is automatically emancipated. And there's no accelerating it, there's no retarding it. There's no such thing as karma. Karma has no effect. You simply have to go through this round, and when you've finished, then you transcend it automatically. Now, this was the doctrine of the Ajivikas. And it was a popular doctrine. That and Jainism were probably the two most popular philosophies that the Buddha had to compete against. This process takes incalculable eons to complete, But, the Buddha says, he has experienced every possible rebirth except those of the 5 pure abodes, the 5 highest states of the form world of samsara, from which rebirth in the human realm is impossible. Thus, the Buddha distinguishes this attainment from that of the Arhants, who are reborn in the 5 pure abodes if they have not extirpated every vestige of attachment. Because a bodhisattva is vowed to being reborn as a human being before he becomes a Buddha, this is impossible for him, and so the Buddha says he has never experienced those rebirths, but he's experienced all the others. Similarly, the Buddha has experienced every kind of abode, every kind of sacrifice, and every kind of fire ceremony. He's done it all. He's establishing himself as the Buddha, of course, by saying that by countering Sanakata's accusations one by one. The Buddha also declares that the lucidity of his wisdom is unimpaired by age, despite the fact that he is 80. Thus, he declares himself to have fulfilled all the requisites of Buddhahood. Nagasamala, the person who is fanning him, declares that the Sutta makes his body hairs erect. Hence, the Buddha declares that he may remember the Sutta as the hair-raising discourse, alluding to the fact that by this time the Buddha's discourses were being memorized by his followers, of course, this being one of the last suttas, in fact, spoken at the end of his life. So that's the talk. Well, it took up the better part of an hour with the questions. Before we proceed with the dedication of merit, or to the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of whatever merit has been generated by this talk to all beings, does anyone have any questions, comments, or discussion concerning anything that we have talked about? Any of you who are new, who are not a member of Dharma by the Tracks, if you're interested in following my activities in Second Life, please join the Dharma Transmission to the group, to the West group, Dharma Transmission to the West group. You can also find this talk posted on my blog, www.palisuttas.com, and it's also now available on note cards, so if you'd like a copy of the note cards, just assuming I am, please, at the end of the talk, and I'll be happy to oblige. So I don't see any questions. I was giving you people a minute to chat, to type, rather. So it seems no one has any. It seems no one has any questions, so let's proceed with dedication of merit. And if anyone wants to join me at Dharma by the Tracks, you're welcome to do so. I'll stay there for a while if anyone wants to chat about anything at all. So let's proceed with the dedication of merit. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege. As always, I will return next Sunday at 2 o'clock Second Life time to discuss the third Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya in our series of talks on the Suttas of the Majjhima Nikaya. Namaskar.